From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I don't like the concept of stopping an investment of $110 billion into the United States. Because you know what they're going to do? They're going to take that money and spend it in Russia or China or someplace else. So I think there are other ways. If it turns out to be as bad as it might be, there are certainly other ways of handling the situation.
President Trump's rejecting calls to cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia following the disappearance and probable murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. The Turkish government says it has audio and video evidence that he was tortured and murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last week. We'll speak with Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna of California, a leading critic of the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen, who's calling for congressional hearings into Khashoggi's disappearance. Then to the incredible story of Henrietta Lacks, the African-American woman whose immortal cells changed modern medicine nearly 70 years after stealing Henrietta Lacks' cells for science. Johns Hopkins University names a building in her honor.
Just the fact that, 65 years later, a sample of our grandmother's cells still exists out in the world today is almost superhuman.
We speak with Henrietta's granddaughter, Jerry, and Rebecca Skloot. Her book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, spent 6 years on the New York Times bestseller list. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This one just looks like a bomb dropped. That's how one search and rescue worker described the catastrophic devastation wrought by Hurricane Michael, the more than Category 4 storm that's killed at least 6 people and devastated communities across the Florida Panhandle. Michael is the third most powerful storm to ever hit the U.S. mainland. Meteorologists say it's supercharged by warmer than usual water in the Gulf of Mexico. Some of Florida's seaside communities, like Mexico Beach, are completely flattened, with homes destroyed and fishing boats flung ashore by the 155-mile-an-hour winds. This is Emily and Elizabeth Hansen, mother and daughter, 2 residents of Mexico Beach.
It's pretty devastating. Like, everybody we know lost their house, everybody, and our jobs.
And did you guys evacuate?
No, we stayed. We stayed in our home. Yeah, it was terrible. It was scary. We lost our chimney, so we have some
flooding damage and throughout the entire house.
On Thursday, Hurricane Michael was downgraded to a tropical storm as it barreled through the Carolinas. States of emergency have been declared in Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia. To see our full coverage of Hurricane Michael and its link to climate change, go to democracynow.org. The Washington Post is reporting the Turkish government has told U.S. officials it has audio and video evidence that Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Officials say the recordings show a Saudi security team snatching Khashoggi as he walked into the consulate October 2nd, then killing him and dismembering his body. The full audio and video recordings have not yet been released. He had written critically about the Saudi government and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The Washington Post has also reported that based on U.S. intelligence intercepts, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, had directly ordered an operation to lure Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia. His alleged murder has sparked a diplomatic crisis for the Trump administration, particularly Trump's son-in-law and senior White House advisor, Jared Kushner, who's cultivated an extremely close relationship with the Saudi Crown Prince. In Washington, a growing number of lawmakers are demanding the United States halt weapons sales to Saudi Arabia over the incident. But on Thursday, Trump rejected the idea.
I don't like stopping massive amounts of money that's being poured into our country. I know they're talking about different kinds of sanctions, but they're spending $110 billion on military equipment and on things that create jobs, like jobs and others for this country. I don't like the concept of stopping an investment of $110 billion into the United States. Because you know what they're going to do? They're going to take that money and spend it in Russia or China or someplace else.
Even before Jamal Khashoggi's suspected death, the Trump administration had been under pressure to halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia over its catastrophic war with Yemen, which has killed thousands of people, pushed millions of Yemenis to the brink of famine, and sparked the world's worst cholera outbreak, with as many as 10,000 new cases of cholera appearing every week. We'll have more on Khashoggi's suspected murder and U.S.-Saudi relations after headlines with California Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna. In immigration news, a new report by Amnesty International says the Trump administration forcibly separated 6,000 families at the U.S.-Mexico border between April and August, a far higher number of children and parents torn apart by immigration officials than previously thought. The report says the administration, quote, is waging a deliberate campaign of human rights violations against asylum seekers in order to broadcast globally that the United States no longer welcomes refugees, unquote. To see our full coverage of the Trump administration's family separation policy, including our report from the U.S.-Mexico border, go to DemocracyNow.org. In more immigration news, the Associated Press is reporting the U.S. Army has discharged over 500 immigrant enlistees over the last year. They were recruited for their language and medical expertise and were initially promised a fast track to citizenship for serving in the U.S. military. After their discharge, many of the recruits now say they were deliberately targeted for their immigration status. They also say the Army's reasons for their discharge, which include refusing to enlist and failing security clearances, were not accurate or fair. Kanye West launched into a 10-minute expletive-riddled rant at the White House Thursday during a meeting with President Trump during what was ostensibly an Oval Office meeting to discuss employment and workforce training programs. This is a clip of Kanye West.
But there's times where, it's something about, I love Hillary, I love everyone, right? But the campaign, I'm with her, just didn't make me feel as a guy that didn't get to see my dad all the time, like a guy that could play catch with his son. There was something about when I put this hat on, it made me feel like Superman. You made a Superman.
Musician and designer Kanye West has come under intense criticism over the last year for praising President Trump and for claiming during a TMZ interview that slavery was a choice. Meanwhile, in more celebrity news, Taylor Swift delivered a political plea to vote in the midterm elections during her Artist of the Year acceptance speech at the American Music Awards Tuesday.
And I just wanted to make a mention of the fact that this award and every single award given out tonight were voted on by the people, and you know what else is voted on by the people? Is the midterm elections on November 6th. Get out and vote. I love you guys.
Taylor Swift also posted an Instagram endorsing two Tennessee Democratic candidates, Phil Bredesen for Senate and Jim Cooper for House of Representatives. Her social media post appears to have sparked a surge in voter registration, particularly in Tennessee. Pope Francis has accepted the resignation of Washington, D.C. Archbishop Cardinal Donald Wuerl over his role in two clergy sexual abuse scandals. One of the scandals was detailed in the explosive report released in August by the Pennsylvania grand jury, which accused Wuerl of covering up for his predecessor, a known sexual abuser. Last week, Pope Francis kicked off a month-long international gathering of bishops to discuss the ongoing sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. In news on Syria, aid workers say thousands of Syrian refugees stranded near the Jordanian border are running out of food as the Syrian armies tightened its siege of the camp in Raqban. About 50,000 refugees live in the camp. Most are women and children. Jordan has also blocked aid deliveries to the camp through its border. The siege comes as in the northwest Syrian province of Idlib, Al Jazeera reports rebel groups are pulling heavy weapons out of parts of the province under a deal brokered between Turkey and Russia aimed at staving off a full-fledged ground offensive in Idlib. The UN has warned a Russian-backed Syrian army offensive against the province, the last major opposition-held territory in Syria, could cause a massive humanitarian crisis. Human Rights Watch says an Egyptian-American limo driver from New York has been subjected to torture and rape at the hands of Egyptian security forces. Khaled Hossein was reportedly arrested in January as he was visiting his wife and children in the Egyptian port city of Alexandria. Egyptian authorities are accusing Hassan of joining the Islamic State, a charge he has denied. In Colombia, human rights groups are denouncing the assassination of yet another human rights activist, Otto Valenzuela, one of the leaders of an environmental community group in the Colombian Amazon. The activist was found shot to death October 8th. Human rights groups say over 100 Colombian activists have been murdered so far this year. Back in the United States, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts has referred more than a dozen misconduct complaints against newly confirmed Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh to a circuit appeals court in Colorado. The 15 misconduct complaints reportedly center on whether Kavanaugh was dishonest and lacked judicial temperament during his Senate testimony. Legal experts say it's unprecedented for a newly confirmed Supreme Court justice to be facing misconduct complaints in a lower court, which could rule it does not have jurisdiction now that Kavanaugh is on the nation's highest court. In financial news, the stock market continued to fall Thursday, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropping over 1,000 points since Wednesday morning, as investors speculated on a range of reasons for the recent meltdown, including the Trump administration's trade war with China. The president lashed out at the Federal Reserve and its decision to raise interest rates.
But I think the Fed is far too stringent, and they're making a mistake, and it's not right. And it's, despite that, we're doing very well, but it's not necessary, in my opinion. And I think I know about it better than they do, believe me.
The state of Washington has become the 20th state to ban the death penalty, with Washington's Supreme Court ruling it's unconstitutional, quote, because it is imposed in an arbitrary and racially biased manner. Thursday's ruling commutes the sentences of 8 men currently on death row in Washington state. A New York judge has dismissed one of the 6 charges against disgraced movie mogul Harvey Weinstein, who's been accused of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment by over 100 women. The case involved the alleged sexual assault of aspiring actor Lucia Evans in 2004. Weinstein, who currently is free on $1 million bail, was arrested in May on a number of charges of sexual assault and rape. He's pleaded not guilty to all charges. In election news, Georgia Democratic gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams is calling for Secretary of State Brian Kemp to step down following an Associated Press report alleging voter suppression ahead of the upcoming November election. The state's exact match system, where even a minor discrepancy in a voter's registration and their official ID could bar them from casting a ballot, has resulted in 53,000 voter applications being put on hold. The highly anticipated race pits progressive African-American Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams against the Republican Secretary of State Brian Kemp. Kemp's office oversees key aspects of voting in the state, including the controversial verification law. 7 out of 10 of the stalled applications are for African-American voters in a state where less than 1/3 of the population is black. And in Arkansas, a sheriff's department is facing widespread criticism after being accused of forcing prisoners to pose for mugshots in Nike T-shirts to mock former San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who sparked NFL-wide protests against racism and police brutality and recently became the new face of Nike's Just Do It campaign. The Union County Sheriff's Office removed the photos of the prisoners wearing the T-shirts after journalist Sean King tweeted about them. Last night, Harvard University awarded Colin Kaepernick the university's W.E.B. Du Bois Medal, which is awarded to individuals who've made significant contributions to African and African-American history and culture. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show with the shocking disappearance and probable murder of the Saudi-born Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The Washington Post is reporting the Turkish government told U.S. officials it has audio and video evidence that Khashoggi, in English, Jamal Khashoggi, was killed last week inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Officials say the recordings confirm that a Saudi security team detained Khashoggi as he walked into the consulate on October 2nd before killing him and dismembering his body. The full audio and video recordings have not yet been released. One person with knowledge of the audio recording told the Washington Post, quote, "You can hear his voice and the voices of men speaking Arabic. You can hear how he was interrogated, tortured, and then murdered," unquote. Khashoggi had written critically about the Saudi government and the Saudi crown prince, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. He fled Saudi Arabia last year and had been living in Virginia. The Washington Post has also reported that based on U.S. intelligence intercepts, the Crown Prince had directly ordered an operation to lure Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia. The Turkish government has accused Saudi Arabia of flying 2 planes into Turkey, carrying 15-man assassination squad to carry out the murder. One of the Saudi men was reportedly a forensic expert known for pioneering rapid and mobile autopsies. Turkish officials say the men used a bone saw to dismember Khashoggi's body before smuggling body parts out of the consulate. According to the Washington Post, at least 7 of the other 15 Saudi men have ties to the Saudi military. The planes then left Istanbul within 8 hours of Khashoggi entering the consulate. Khashoggi had entered the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul seeking a document he needed to get married. His fiancée waited for him outside the building, but he never came back out. They were supposed to get married the next day. In Washington, a growing number of lawmakers are demanding the United States halt weapons sales to Saudi Arabia over the incident. But on Thursday, Trump rejected the idea.
I would not be in favor of stopping a country from spending $110 billion, which is an all-time record, and letting Russia have that money and letting China have that money, because all they're going to do is say, that's okay, we don't have to buy it from Boeing, we don't have to buy it from Lockheed, we don't have to buy it from Raytheon and all these great companies. We'll buy it from Russia, we'll buy it from China. So what good does that do us? There are other things we can do.
Well, do you think they should pay a price if it's
Yeah, there'll be something that has to take place. First, I want to find out what happened, and we're looking. Again, this took place in Turkey, and to the best of our knowledge, Khashoggi is not a United States citizen. Is that right, or is that right? He's a permanent resident. Okay. We don't like it, John. We don't like it, and we don't like it even a little bit. But as to whether or not we should stop $110 billion from being spent in this country, knowing they have 4 or 5 alternatives, 2 very good alternatives, that would not be acceptable.
We go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna of California, calling for congressional hearings into possible Saudi complicity in the disappearance and the possible murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, or Khashoggi in Arabic. Congressmember Khanna has been one of the most vocal critics on Capitol Hill of the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen. Congressmember Khanna, welcome back to Democracy Now! What is the latest you understand has happened to the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, it's appalling. I don't think there has been any precedent for someone, a journalist, being taken to a consulate, going to a consulate, and being murdered. And we don't know all the facts. We need to find out all the facts. But this is a pattern with Saudi Arabia of barbarity. And they've been doing this in Yemen, where almost 16,000 civilians have been killed. Many of those civilians have been killed with Lockheed Martin and Raytheon bombs. And this is why many of us on Capitol Hill want to stop any arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
Now, I want to talk about the Yemen war in a minute, the U.S.-backed Yemen war. But on this issue of Khashoggi, Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, when pushed on is the Pentagon investigating this, he said something like, intellectually. Donald Trump, obviously the famous tweeter, had not tweeted almost anything on this in the days after Khashoggi's disappearance. Can Can you talk about exactly what the U.S. relationship is with Saudi Arabia? Also, of course, it implicates Jared Kushner, the senior advisor, President Trump's son-in-law, very close to Mohammed bin Salman, and this information Washington Post put out about they already had wanted to get Khashoggi to lure him back to Saudi Arabia for, well, who knows what they wanted to do with him, to lure him from Saudi Arabia. Also, this information that he had gone to the Saudi consulate, the embassy in Washington, but they told him he had to go to Istanbul. He goes to Istanbul to the consulate there, and they tell him, fine, they're going to give him that marriage document he needed. But he had to come back in a week. So he goes to London, participates in a meeting last week, and goes back, which presumably is for them to prepare and to bring these 2 planes in with the forensic expert and the military and intelligence people. And at least according to these latest reports, if this is true, with the video and audio evidence, he was murdered and dismembered within a few hours, and then the planes flew out.
Well, it's brutal. And what we also know are reports that U.S. intelligence agencies may have been aware that Khashoggi's life was going to be at risk. And Mark Pocan and I have written calling for the declassification of information that our intelligence agencies had about any threats to Khashoggi's life, because, as you know, it's against the law for us not to have warned a permanent resident of the United States about a possible threat to his life. And there are many unanswered questions about what the United States government knew, why we didn't give advance warning if we did have any information. And, of course, as you alluded to, Kushner has been pushing, since he's been in the administration, for a closer tie to the Saudis, largely because he sees the Saudis as facilitating a peace deal from his perspective with Israel. And they've really had carte blanche under the Trump administration to do what they want in Yemen. And now I think the administration is embarrassed when they see the brutality that the Saudis are capable of in this case.
I want to go back to President Trump speaking Thursday about calls to cut off Saudi arms sales.
Like stopping massive amounts of money that's being poured into our country. I know they're talking about different kinds of sanctions, but they're spending $110 billion on military equipment and on things that create jobs. I don't like the concept of stopping an investment of $110 billion into the United States. Because you know what they're going to do? They're going to take that money and spend it in Russia or China or someplace else. So I think there are other ways. If it turns out to be as bad as it might be, there are certainly other ways of handling the situation.
So, Ro Khanna, you're a Democratic member of the House of Representatives. Trump says they're not cutting off military weapons sales. Of course, the military weapons contractors in the United States benefit enormously, and if you could maybe name some of those that do. But what does the House of Representatives have the power to do?
Well, we in the Senate can cut off these arms sales, and it's very important that the president is peddling falsehoods and to correct the record. It's not as if Saudi Arabia can go and suddenly buy aircrafts or tanks from Russia. It would take decades for them to switch. They're so dependent on U.S. technology. It would be as if you had an iPhone and an Apple computer. Suddenly you couldn't go switch to Windows. These things aren't transferable. And the president knows this. He knows that if we were to cut off the arms sales, the Saudis wouldn't be able to quickly switch to Russia or China, and it would really hurt their efforts in Yemen. And the reality is, it's Lockheed Martin, Raytheon's bombs that are being found in Yemen responsible for the deaths of children and women. So first, the president is wrong that the Saudis could switch. Secondly, $100 billion in the context of a $20 trillion economy is not a significant detriment to the United States. I don't think there's a single American citizen who would say that we should be aiding the Saudis and killing women and children for $100 billion, that's a price worth paying.
In August, the Twitter account for Canada's foreign ministry tweeted, Canada is gravely concerned about additional arrests of civil society and women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia, including Samar Badawi. We urge the Saudi authorities to immediately release them and all other peaceful human rights activists. That was a tweet. Within 6 hours of the tweet, Canada's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia was barred from returning to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi ambassador to Canada was recalled. New trade with Canada was halted. It was ordered to withdraw Saudi investment in Canada. More than 8,300 Saudi post-secondary students were told to pull out of Canada. Flights to Canada by the Saudi-owned airline were canceled. This is for one tweet urging the Saudi Arabian government to release some of the women driver activists.
Well, this is a pattern of brutality. It's a pattern of no concern for human rights. And my concern representing Silicon Valley is that the Saudis have had, as you know, a huge influence in Silicon Valley. They're trying to put a foothold. They're invested in Uber. They have this Davos in the Desert conference where they invite tech leaders. The tech community needs to be very clear that they're not going to take Saudi money and Saudi investment. And this has to be not just Congress stopping arms sales, but the United States technology and investment community cutting off ties with the Saudis. I'm pleased that Uber has said they're not going to participate in the conference, and Sam Altman from Y Combinator recently said that, and I hope others will follow their lead.
Well, I want to talk about that. If people haven't heard of it, and maybe people hadn't until now, many journalists and media organizations are beginning to pull out of this high-profile conference in Saudi Arabia that's scheduled for next week, following the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. But the Future Investment Initiative Conference, which is scheduled for the 23rd to the 25th of October, still has a long roster of high-level attendees, including Executive Chair of Colony Capital, Thomas Barrack, Global Markets Editor for Fox Business, Maria Bartiromo, United States General David Petraeus, President of the World Bank, Jim Young Kim, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, Raytheon Company CEO Thomas Kennedy. I think the New York Times has pulled out. There are other top journalists or TV personalities who are also going. Well, what about even the government officials? Can Congress say no to government officials going, like Mnuchin?
I don't know if Congress has the authority to prevent the Secretary of Treasury from going. We can certainly write to him and urge him not to go. And I think common sense on his part should lead him to cancel the trip. Look, it's not a controversial statement for the United States to stand up for an American resident who is engaged in the freedom of press, the freedom of expression, and is being brutally murdered at a consulate, a place that's supposed to be safe. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. And I was encouraged that even Senator Bob Corker raised the question that are on so many minds. Why do we need Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia is overestimating their strategic importance to the United States. And I think this incident has forced a re-examination. And when we look deeper, we're going to see the extraordinary barbarity and the killing of civilians that the Saudi government has been engaged in Yemen.
Trump just said the king needs us. But you have this growing number of Republicans, like Lindsey Graham, who said if this is proven, what happened to Khashoggi, there would be hell to pay. As you mentioned, there's Corker. Rand Paul has said some things. I think even Marco Rubio. So what would this take to get a vote in Congress in both houses?
I think we're building towards that. I think you've seen bipartisan support growing. Several things. One, we need to get more of the facts. I think it's a encouraging development that Turkey has video and audio evidence of what took place, and I think that will be very compelling if there is evidence that clearly links the killing to the Saudi government. Second, we need to look at what the U.S. government knew, as I raised earlier, because if there is evidence that we were somehow sitting on information and didn't share it, that is a bombshell, and that will influence people's opinion. But you see a growing sense among my colleagues that the relationship with the Saudis is not consistent with our values and isn't in our national interest, that a few $100 billion is not worth an entanglement in further wars and complicity in human rights abuses.
I wanted to go very quickly to Yemen. Last month, you introduced a resolution invoking the 1973 War Powers Act, declaring Congress never authorized U.S. support for the coalition in Yemen. Even during the Obama years, the U.S. was providing weapons support for the Saudi-UAE attack on Yemen that's caused the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world. But President Trump went a step further, pulled back any restrictions on these weapons and refueling. What happened to your resolution, and will you be reintroducing it?
Well, we had introduced this resolution, Amy, as you know, about a year and a half ago, and very few people had gotten on board. You were, of course, ahead of the curve and really have been sounding the alarm in Yemen, one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes. I'm encouraged that we reintroduced this about 4 weeks ago, and we now have Steny Hoyer, who is the #2 person in the House, and the chair of the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the ranking member of the Rules Committee, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, all on board with the resolution to stop any aid in the Saudi bombing of Yemen. And the reason is they've seen the same reports, the bus bombings killing children and women, the fact that Lockheed Martin and Raytheon's bombs have been found in Yemen responsible for the deaths of children. This is something that has stirred the conscience of the United States Congress, and I am actually quite optimistic that certainly if we take back the House of Representatives, we will be able to pass this, and we may even be able to pass this in the lame duck, given the Khashoggi case and given the changing opinion among Republicans.
Ro Khanna, I want to ask you to stay with us. I want to ask you about Amazon, Facebook, and your Internet Bill of Rights. Ro Khanna is a Democratic congressman from California, has called for congressional hearings into possible Saudi complicity with the disappearance and probable murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He's been a leading critic of U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. We'll be back with him in 30 seconds. The theme from Missing by Vangelis here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our conversation with Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna. I want to switch gears from Yemen and Saudi Arabia, the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, to talk about Amazon, which recently became the country's second $1 trillion company. On October 2nd, a video went viral showing Amazon senior vice president telling hundreds of Amazon workers the company's minimum wage was being increased to $15 an hour.
So effective November 1st, we are also establishing a new Amazon minimum wage of $15 an hour.
Amazon's embrace of a $15 an hour minimum wage made headlines, was praised by many in Washington and all over the country. But it turns out Amazon's new pay structure might result in lower take-home compensation for many workers because Amazon is removing some incentive-based bonuses and stock options. Congressman Ro Khanna, you're the author of the Stop Bezos Act in Congress. Can you talk about this latest news?
Sure. Well, Senator Bernie Sanders and I, about 4 weeks ago, introduced the Stop Bezos Act, which was very simple. We said, if you're working at a billion-dollar company and you're not making enough to be able to afford food and you're reliant on public benefits like food stamps, then the taxpayer shouldn't be paying for that. The companies should be paying for that. And we publicly called on Jeff Bezos to raise wages to $15, to look to the model of Henry Ford, who did that in 1914. Jeff Bezos, to our surprise and to his credit, responded. He raised wages to $15. I think he saw all these Amazon workers who courageously were testifying. Our bill, by the way, was panned by all the Beltway economists, but it did put pressure on Bezos. And I do think 350,000 people are going to get a raise. Now, you're correct that they have taken away some of the bonuses and grants to stock options. I don't think they should have done that. I do think that's going to hurt a small number of workers, and I hope they'll reconsider that. But in the aggregate, this is a huge raise for many, many workers, and my hope is Walmart, McDonald's, and other industries will follow.
The salary change will not apply to contract workers. That's right, just salary workers. The majority of Amazon workers are contract.
That is correct. I mean, it applies to part-time workers. It applies to about 350,000 workers, but it does not apply to contract workers. And you raise an excellent point. I mean, contract workers are being underpaid, not just at Amazon, but many places in my district in Silicon Valley where they are not being able to unionize and they're not getting benefits. And that's a huge issue for our society.
Congressman Khanna, I also want to ask you about the fallout from last week's Facebook data breach announcement, which continues as the company is rushing to reassure users that there's no evidence that hackers were able to access third-party apps such as Instagram, Spotify, or the New York Times, which many people access via their Facebook accounts. The breach may have affected up to 50 million users, and we should point out that you're a congressmember from California, from Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. This is why I have called for an Internet Bill of Rights. I just released it with Tim Berners-Lee, who is the founder of the World Wide Web, with some very simple principles that people should know what is happening to their data. People should be notified if there's a breach. People should have the right to consent before their data is collected. It's been a year since the Cambridge Analytica, or 6 months since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, a year since the Equifax scandal, and now there are new breaches with Facebook, with Google. It is time that the Congress do something. We've laid out a 10-part principle for rights for folks online, and I believe this has to be a top priority for the next Congress.
The Wall Street Journal is reporting that Google will shut down its social network Google Plus after revelations of a data breach that exposed the private data of hundreds of thousands of users. The breach discovered in March but was not disclosed to the public. An internal Google memo showed executives were worried they'd face new government regulations if news of the data breach got out. Congressmember Khanna.
Well, that's unacceptable, and it's why we need an Internet Bill of Rights. One of the Bill of Rights is that you have to be notified in a timely manner within 24 or 48 hours. And if the breach were discovered in March, people would have, by law, been required to be notified in March, and they would have known where their data was sent and what that data was used for. Right now, there are no laws. I mean, obviously, Google should have acted more responsibly, but I also blame the United States Congress because we have not required these laws. Europe has with the GDPR, and it's time that the United States Congress act to protect people online.
Ro Khanna, we want to thank you for being with us. Democratic Congressmember from California has called for congressional hearings into possible Saudi complicity in the disappearance and the probable murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, has been a leading critic of U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, has also introduced the Internet Bill of Rights. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the remarkable story of Henrietta Lacks. Johns Hopkins University has just named a building for her. We'll speak with her grandson and with the woman who made her granddaughter and the woman who made her story known around the world, Rebecca Skloot, who wrote the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Stay with us.
You can deny me, you can decide to turn your face away. No matter, 'cause there's something inside so strong. I know that I can make it, though you're doing me wrong. thought that my pride was gone. Oh no, there's something inside so strong. Oh, something inside so strong. The more you refuse to hear my voice, the louder I will sing. You hide behind walls of Jericho. Your lies will come tumbling.
Something Inside So Strong by Lavi Sifri. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This week, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, announced plans to name a new research building after Henrietta Lacks, a former patient at the university hospital who's become known for her immortal cells. Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman. She permanently changed modern medicine nearly 70 years ago when it was discovered her cells could live forever. These immortal cells have helped scientists produce remedies for numerous diseases, including the first polio vaccine that have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. This is Johns Hopkins University President Ronald Daniels speaking at the 9th Annual Henrietta Lacks Memorial Lecture shortly before announcing the naming of the new building after Henrietta Lacks.
Now, each year, this day has, of course, been afforded us an opportunity to celebrate and acknowledge Henrietta Lacks, who through her life and through her immortal cells, not only made an immeasurable impact on medical science, but contributed to a profound transformation in our approach to scientific inquiry and ethics and integrity that must, of course, undergird the entire scientific research enterprise.
Johns Hopkins says the new Henrietta Lacks campus building will feature courses and activities that promote research ethics and community engagement. Some members of Lacks' family, however, have criticized Johns Hopkins' use of Lacks cells, raising questions about privacy and patient rights, as well as whether the family should receive compensation for their use. Researchers at Hopkins took Lacks cells without her consent when she was a patient there in 1951. She died of cervical cancer the same year, but her cells were soon being duplicated in labs across the globe. For decades, the woman whose cells would save countless lives was not known by name. Instead, she was just known as, her cells were just known as HeLa cells, H-E-L-A, the first two letters of Henrietta Lacks' first and last name. Even her family had no clue about her legacy until more than 20 years after her death. Last year, HBO made a movie about Henrietta Lacks and her family's journey to discover her true history. It stars Oprah Winfrey as Deborah Lacks, Henrietta's daughter, and Rose Byrne as Rebecca Skloot, the author of the groundbreaking book on Henrietta's life, titled The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This is the movie's trailer.
For years, it seemed like a dream. About our mother, could this be true? What you don't understand is, we didn't know nothing about nothing.
Scientists had been trying to get cells to grow outside of the human body, but they would always die. Until Henrietta's cells came along.
I want to write a book about your mother.
Go HeLa, go HeLa. That's my mother. Hope I don't regret this.
Everyone's saying Henrietta Lacks donated themselves. She didn't donate nothing. They took them and didn't ask.
The hospital is guilty, and somebody's going to pay.
God wanna have a disease cure, he provide one for himself.
I don't know, Rebecca.
I'm not doing anything behind your back. Henrietta helped develop the AIDS cocktail, chemotherapy treatments.
hard not to get caught up in hope when you've been powerless for so long. I know I'm a part of you, and you're a part of me.
That was the trailer for the movie The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I watched it last night after midnight on the train up from Washington, D.C., an astonishing film. We're joined now by two guests. In Berkeley, California, Rebecca Skloot joins us, the author of the best-selling book on which that film was made, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And in Baltimore, Maryland, we're joined by Jerry Lacks-Why, the granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! I want to start with Rebecca, before we talk about the building, to talk about this story, for people to understand how significant Henrietta Lacks's cells are to the contribution of science, a contribution she did not know she was making at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a person out there who hasn't benefited in numerous ways from the cells. You know, the vaccines that we all get were developed using her cells. They were the first, her genes were some of the first ever sequenced. They went up into space to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. In vitro fertilization was developed with the help of her cells. I mean, just the list goes on and on and on. It's just kind of inconceivable.
What was it about Henrietta Lacks' cells, the HeLa line? What is it about her cells? I mean, she had cervical cancer.
Yeah, so these are her cancer cells, and she had an incredibly aggressive cancer that grew sort of unlike many cancers. It went from a tiny tumor on her cervix to just within a few months, there were just tumors covering every organ in her body. And part of what is amazing about her cells is that they were first, but also they grow with this intensity that really was never seen in the labs and kind of hasn't been seen since.
And so what did Johns Hopkins do? How did they realize this? And then how did they take the cells and what happened to them?
Yeah, so they didn't realize anything. I mean, she just happened to walk into Hopkins in the 50s at a time when scientists all around the world were trying to grow human cells outside the body, and it had never worked. And so at Hopkins, there was one of the leading tissue culture researchers who was kind of at the head of this field, and he was taking samples from anyone he could get his hands on, any patients who walked into the hospital, himself, his kids, his friends, and basically was just trying to grow any cells he could. And so it really was this kind of chance confluence of events that Henrietta, with this incredible cancer, arrived at the location where this man had been trying to do this for so long. So it wasn't that they targeted her, that they said, oh, her cells are interesting. She just went in for a routine biopsy of her tumor, and they just took an extra little piece and put that in a dish. And that's what became the cell line, and that she never knew about.
But they did, and they knew how valuable it was. So they didn't tell her she died, and they didn't tell her family. Is that right? In fact, they understood that they wanted information from her family as well, their genes as well.
So actually they didn't know these were going to be valuable. So at the time, we didn't know anything about cells. They were just trying to cure cancer. They were like, if we can grow cancer cells outside the body, maybe we can figure out why it's so powerful. They had no concept. There was no industry connected to any of this, or biology really in general. DNA hadn't been discovered yet, so they couldn't know that someday they'd be able to look in these cells and learn about her family. So it's important to look at this story within the context of history in that way, that they really had no idea what they were potentially discovering. Or that there was potentially any gain in it. And they didn't have any sense that they wanted anything from her family until 25 years later in the 70s. And at that point, you know, genome sequencing was starting, and what they wanted to do was look at some of her family member cells and their genes. And it was in order to learn more about the cells. There was no financial interest at that point. There wasn't someone saying, oh, we can make a bunch of money if we take samples from her family. It wasn't that at all. But they went back to her kids at that point because there were things they needed to know about HeLa cells, that they wanted to be able to learn about her genes in order to do that.
And did they explain this to the Lacks family as they were doing experimentation on them?
Yeah, no, and that's the key. I mean, there are sort of several big ethical moments in the story, and the first is in the 50s, they took these samples without her knowledge. You know, should we do that? Should we not? That was the 50s. And then in the 70s, when they went back to her family, it raises these other questions about what should people have to be told when they're kind of researchers are going back to them and asking for more samples. And in the 50s, we didn't have any practice related to that. There were no laws saying they needed to ask. It wasn't standard procedure. But in the 70s, it was. The law had actually been written saying you have to ask in a situation like this, but hadn't been codified into law. But at the time, most people would have asked, and they didn't. The family thought that they were being tested to see if they had the same cancer that Henrietta had, which wasn't the case. So they actually thought they were receiving medical care when, in fact, they were being used in research, and there was no personal gain to them at all. And Deborah, her daughter, asked a lot of questions in that moment about what was going on, and just nobody explained it to her. And to me, that's the heart of the ethical story is that moment when her family got drawn into research without their knowledge, without their consent. And then, this continued to happen over the generations after that.
And using her cells without their consent, your book is published. The scientists sequenced the HeLa genome, posted online. What was the impact for the Lacks family? And did you feel that constituted an ethical breach before we go to Jerry?
Yeah, so, in 2013, so 3 years after the book came out, a group of scientists sequenced the HeLa genome, which had a lot of value for science because you can learn a lot about the cells that way. But the cells also contain Henrietta's personal genes. And yeah, they posted this online. And, these days people take, swabs of your cheek cells and send it to companies like 23andMe, and you get this report that says everything from, you may get early onset Alzheimer's to, you have male pattern baldness genes or whatever. And, people often go to genetic counseling to decide if they want that information. They certainly don't usually publish it online or have that happen without their knowledge. And that was what happened with these in this moment, was that the genome was sequenced, posted online where anyone could download it, and you could learn a lot about Henrietta, her kids, her grandkids from that. And so it was a big moment. And also there were no laws saying that couldn't happen. And in fact, there had just been a commission. Obama had just had his bioethics commission look at the question of whether we were in danger, sort of the way that the regulations were now, of this being able to happen to people. And it was just a couple months later it happened to the Lacks family, which is sort of what happens with bioethical questions. If it's going to apply to you or to me or anyone watching this show related to your cells, your genes, privacy, it's probably going to happen to them first. So and that's one of the things that the family in that moment, once they found out it had happened, they said, okay, this is enough. We want to be part of this. From here on out, we don't want future generations to have this happen to them again. And sort of long story short, they ended up taking the sequence offline, and the NIH ended up creating essentially a committee with a few members of the Lacks family and some scientists, where now if you want to do research using the genome of the HeLa cells, not the cells themselves, just the genes, you have to put in an application, and it's actually reviewed by a few members of the Lacks family to see if they feel like it's warranted.
So I want to bring Jerry Lacks-Y into this discussion, the granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks, known around the world. Her contributions to medicine are immeasurable, but not known as Henrietta Lacks, known as HeLa and the HeLa cells taken from her name. Jerry, when did you understand what happened to your grandmother's cells?
It was when the book actually came out. That's when I found out a lot of information about my grandmother, about her tremendous contributions to science. We knew when we were growing up that she helped with the polio vaccine. We knew that she died from cancer, but we just didn't know what type of cancer she died from. So when the book came out, it gave us so much information that we didn't know, that our parents didn't know. So it was like a generational thing where one generation didn't know, so they couldn't tell the next generation. So now the grandchildren know, Henrietta's children know, so we make sure that our children know so it can carry on, so they can carry the legacy and bring awareness to Henrietta's tremendous and huge contributions to science.
Now, you were involved in the decision of Johns Hopkins to name the building after your grandmother, Henrietta Lacks. Can you talk about the evolving relationship between you, the family, and Johns Hopkins?
Well, we had a discussion last year about naming a building after Henrietta Lacks. You know, some family members agreed and some family members didn't agree about naming a building, and that's expected. We have a large family. A lot of people are opinionated, so we was grateful that they actually moved forward with naming the building, and it was just amazing because I know at one point last year when we was talking about, you know, what we wanted Johns Hopkins to do to honor our grandmother, one of the family members said, okay, well, maybe they should name a wing after Henrietta Lacks, or maybe they should put a bench near Johns Hopkins with her name, or name a Henrietta Lacks reading room inside of Johns Hopkins. But when they came to us and said, okay, well, we're going to name a building, an entire building after your grandmother, you know, we was excited and grateful that actually Johns Hopkins is honoring our grandmother in such a fulfilling and tremendous way.
Now, you and two other family members serve on a panel at the National Institutes of Health to approve who gets to use the HeLa cells in their research. Jerry Laxwhy?
Yes, it is. It's two family members. Well, actually three. In the beginning, it was just two, but then they added another family member to serve on the committee. And what we do is just review applications from researchers just to make sure that they meet the criteria that has been formulated to make sure that they meet what is required of them. And just, I mean, it has been exciting just to actually look at, even though I'm not a sciencey type of person, but just to look at what researchers are using the HeLa cells for and what they're hoping to accomplish. And I mean, I just look at it as like these really big words, so I have to Google some of the words to kind of get an understanding. But the main part is that the family is directly involved. We're not the last to know, you know, we're the first to know. So I think that gives us an advantage in taking control of our grandmother's data.
Was any financial deal ever worked out between the university, researchers, and your family, the Lacks family? No compensation. And how did monetary? We wasn't asking. How did you feel about the HBO film with Oprah Winfrey that portrayed your family and what happened with your grandmother's cells?
I think the movie did a very good job. It definitely got the story out there for people who are non-readers or people that don't like reading a lot. They portrayed my, you know, some family members very well. And the only thing I kind of like, okay, some of the dialogue, it was like a little country. But other than that, I mean, everyone portrayed each family member very well. I think they did a very nice job in doing the story. I wish it was a little longer, like a mini series, or they could have did a two-part. But in all, it was a great movie. I think it was a great movie. And, you know, so many people just come up to us and just say, you know, we're happy and glad that this movie has been done. We're happy and glad that the book has been written, because so many people don't know her story. Well, don't even know her story.
Rebecca Skloot writes, one scientist estimates if you could pile all HeLa cells ever grown onto a scale, they'd weigh more than 50 million metric tons, an inconceivable number, given that an individual cell weighs almost nothing. Another scientist calculated if you could lay all HeLa cells ever grown end to end, they'd wrap around the Earth at least 3 times, spanning more than 350 million feet. In her prime, Henrietta herself stood only a bit over 5 feet tall. Jerry Laxwhy, as we wrap up, we just have 10 seconds. How proud are you of your grandmother?
Oh, words can't describe how proud I am of my grandmother. I mean, just knowing her story and what she has done, not just for a certain group or she just did so much for the world, and I'm just so proud that I had the chance, or I'm getting the chance to know my grandmother, to know her contributions, and to actually go out and advocate and
We're
bring
going to have to leave it there. Jerry Laxwhy, I want to thank you so much, and we'll continue part 2 with Rebecca Skloot, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I'm Amy Goodman.